A nation under shadow. Picture this. It's 2:30 in the morning and you're staring at the ceiling of your bedroom, mind churning through tomorrow's impossible decisions. Now imagine that same sleepless wait, but the decisions you're wrestling with will determine whether an entire civilization survives or falls into darkness. It's May 1940, and 65 feet beneath the streets of Westminster, in a maze of reinforced concrete corridors that smell of damp earth and cigarette smoke, the most consequential leadership crisis of the 20th century is unfolding. The Cabinet War Rooms, a place where the weight of nations presses down through tons of London clay above, where electric bulbs burn around the clock because there are no windows, no natural light, no connection to the ordinary world, where people still believe in the luxury of certainty. You know that feeling, don't you? When you're building something that matters and suddenly the ground shifts beneath everything you thought you understood. When the comfortable assumptions that carried you this far simply evaporate. Winston Churchill has been Prime Minister for exactly 10 days. 10 days. Less time than it takes you to hire a new team member, and he's inherited a situation that would break most leaders before they'd even grasped its full scope. But here's what strikes me about this moment. It's not the grand speeches or the stirring rhetoric that define it. It's the quiet hours, the sleepless calculations, the weight of carrying something larger than yourself when failure isn't just personal disappointment, it's the end of everything you're trying to protect. The news arriving in those underground rooms reads like a cascade of business failures, but with stakes that dwarf anything we might face. Norway, fallen. Denmark, fallen. Holland, fallen. Belgium, crumbling. And now the German war machine is pouring through France like water through a broken dam. The French government, that great ally Britain has counted on, is fracturing. Their generals are speaking openly of surrender. Their politicians are calculating the terms of defeat before the battle is even finished. You felt this, haven't you? When the market shifts, when your key partner pulls out, when the funding round falls through, and suddenly you're looking at a completely different landscape than the one you planned for. That moment when you realize the rules of the game have changed, and you're still playing by the old ones. But here's where Churchill's response teaches us something profound about leadership under impossible pressure. While his generals are calculating retreat routes and his politicians are whispering about negotiated settlements, he's asking a different question entirely. Not how do we minimize our losses, but what are we actually fighting for? In the map room, where colored pins track the German advance across Europe like a spreading infection, you can almost hear the conversations that must have echoed through those corridors. Senior officials, men who've spent their careers managing the machinery of empire, are beginning to speak the unthinkable. Perhaps it's time to explore terms. Perhaps Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, has a point when he suggests that Britain might negotiate from a position of, well, not strength exactly, but before things get worse. It's the most rational response in the world. When you're facing overwhelming odds, when your resources are stretched beyond breaking point, when every expert is telling you the mathematics don't work, the reasonable thing is to find the best possible exit strategy. And this is where the weight you carry as a leader becomes most acute, isn't it? Because sometimes the reasonable path isn't the right one. Churchill understands something that his colleagues are struggling to grasp. This isn't just a territorial dispute or a political disagreement that can be resolved through clever diplomacy. What's advancing across Europe isn't just an army. It's the systematic destruction of everything that makes civilization worth defending. The camps are already operating in Germany. The books are already burning. The very idea that human beings possess inherent dignity, regardless of their race or politics or beliefs, that idea is being methodically erased. Picture him in those underground rooms, a man who's spent decades in political wilderness, who's been dismissed as a warmonger and a relic, suddenly thrust into the position where his warnings about the nature of this threat have become terrifyingly relevant. The weight of vindication offers no comfort when vindication means your worst fears are coming true. You know this feeling. When you've been predicting a market crash or warning about a competitor or seeing risks that others dismiss as pessimism, and then you're right. But being right doesn't feel like victory when the consequences are devastating. The German advance isn't just military genius, though it is that. It's the application of industrial principles to warfare. mass production applied to conquest. They've studied how businesses achieve efficiency at scale, and they've applied those lessons to the machinery of subjugation. It's systematic, it's predictable, it's working. And against this machine, Britain stands almost alone. The Royal Navy, yes, still the finest in the world, but navies don't hold territory. The Royal Air Force, certainly, but outnumbered and fighting from bases that could be overrun within weeks. The Army, well, the Army is trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, waiting for a miracle that military logic says cannot come. This is the context in which Churchill faces his first great test as Prime Minister. Not in Parliament, not in the newspapers, but in the War Cabinet meetings, where 5 men will decide whether Britain fights on alone or seeks terms with Hitler, while negotiation is still possible. Lord Halifax presents the case with the cool logic of a man who spent his career managing difficult situations. The French are finished. That much is clear. The Americans show no sign of entering the war. The Soviet Union has a non-aggression pact with Germany. Britain faces the combined industrial might of a Nazi-controlled Europe with resources that are already stretched to breaking point. Surely the responsible thing is to explore what terms might be available while Britain still has something to negotiate with. It's the argument that every leader faces when the odds turn against them. Cut your losses, live to fight another day. Don't let pride destroy what you've built when pragmatism might preserve it. But Churchill sees what Halifax cannot, or will not. Some fights aren't about winning and losing in the conventional sense. Some fights are about what you become in the process of fighting them, and some enemies cannot be negotiated with because their very existence depends on your destruction. The weight of this decision, imagine carrying it. Not just the immediate consequences, but the knowledge that you're choosing a path that will demand everything from your people. That will require them to endure bombing, rationing, the loss of sons and daughters, the complete transformation of their way of life. And you're making this choice not because victory is certain, but because surrender is unthinkable. This is leadership at its most elemental. When all the clever strategies and careful compromises fall away, and you're left with a simple question: what are you willing to sacrifice to preserve what matters most? In those underground rooms, surrounded by maps that show the enemy advancing on every front, Churchill begins to articulate something that will either save his nation or destroy it. Britain will fight on, not because the odds favor success, but because the alternative isn't really living at all. The German war machine that seems so unstoppable. It has a weakness that its leaders cannot see. It's built on the assumption that people, when faced with overwhelming force, will choose survival over principle, that nations, like businesses, will ultimately accept any terms that allow them to continue existing. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if there are things worth more than survival? What if the very act of refusing to surrender, regardless of the consequences, changes the entire nature of the conflict? As Churchill walks those concrete corridors, past the rooms where clerks are working through the night to coordinate a resistance that exists more in hope than in reality, he's carrying the weight of a choice that will define not just his leadership, but the character of his entire civilization. The easy path, the rational path, the path that preserves British lives and British institutions in some form, that path leads through Berlin. It means accepting that the future belongs to those who worship power above truth, efficiency above humanity, order above freedom. The other path? Well, the other path leads into darkness, into months and years of struggle against impossible odds, into the transformation of a comfortable island nation into something harder, more focused, more willing to sacrifice everything for principles that cannot be quantified or negotiated. But here's what Churchill understands, what every leader who's built something meaningful eventually learns. Sometimes the choice isn't between success and failure. Sometimes it's between becoming who you need to be and remaining who you've always been. The weight you carry tonight, as you stare at your own impossible decisions, as you calculate your own overwhelming odds, it's part of the same continuum, the same fundamental test of what you're willing to sacrifice to preserve what you're building. In those underground rooms in May 1940, the future of human civilization hangs in the balance. Not because of grand strategies or superior resources, but because of a simple question that every leader must eventually answer. When everything seems lost, when every rational voice counsels surrender, when the weight of responsibility threatens to crush you, what do you choose to become? The German armies are advancing, the French resistance is crumbling, the American cavalry isn't coming, and in the cabinet war rooms, 5 men are about to make a decision that will change the world, but first, they have to survive the next 24 hours. Whispers of peace. The morning light filters through the grimy windows of Downing Street, but down in the cabinet war rooms, time moves differently. Here, beneath the streets of London, the weight of empire rests on mahogany tables and in leather-bound folders marked Most Secret. Lord Halifax adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles and studies the latest dispatches from France. Edward Frederick Lindley Wood, 1st Earl of Halifax, a man whose very name carries the weight of centuries of British diplomacy. Foreign Secretary, former Viceroy of India, a figure who has walked the corridors of power with the measured step of inherited authority. And today he believes Britain should seek terms with Hitler. You know this feeling, don't you? When the numbers simply don't add up. When every spreadsheet, every projection, every honest assessment points to the same inevitable conclusion. Halifax sees what you see in those 2 a.m. moments of brutal clarity. The mathematics of survival. The German Wehrmacht has swept through Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland. France, proud France with her Maginot Line and her promises of eternal resistance, is collapsing like a house of cards. The British Expeditionary Force is trapped at Dunkirk, and the Royal Navy is already planning the most desperate evacuation in military history. Halifax opens his leather portfolio and removes a single sheet of paper. The latest intelligence estimates. German divisions, 140. British divisions available for home defense, 12. The Luftwaffe, 3,500 aircraft. The RAF, fewer than 700 operational fighters. These are not the odds that reasonable men accept. Sir Edward Bridges sits at the far end of the table, fountain pen poised above his notepad. Cabinet Secretary, keeper of minutes, the man whose careful handwriting will record whatever decision emerges from this room. He has served 3 prime ministers, witnessed the rise and fall of governments, seen empires shift like sand, but he has never seen anything like this. Bridges understands something that perhaps only civil servants truly grasp. That history is made not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small decisions. The choice of one word over another, the pause before a signature, the moment when someone decides to speak or remain silent. He watches Halifax arrange his papers with the methodical precision of a man who has spent decades managing the impossible. India's independence movement, the abdication crisis, the Munich Agreement. Halifax has navigated waters that would have drowned lesser men. And his conclusion is simple. Britain must explore the possibility of negotiated peace. Listen to his reasoning, because it carries the terrible logic of leadership under pressure. Every hour Britain fights on, more young men die. Every day of continued resistance brings the German invasion fleet closer to British shores. Every week of defiance makes the eventual terms of surrender more brutal. Halifax has read Mein Kampf. He knows what Hitler intends for a conquered Britain. But he also knows what Napoleon intended for Britain, what Philip II of Spain intended, what Kaiser Wilhelm intended. And yet, here Britain stands, because sometimes the art of survival lies not in glorious resistance, but in strategic retreat. The Foreign Secretary's voice carries the weight of Eton and Oxford, of 1,000 diplomatic receptions where empires were carved up over brandy and cigars. Prime Minister, he will say when Churchill arrives, we must consider the possibility that continued resistance serves no one, least of all the British people. It is the argument of accumulated wisdom, the voice of experience whispering that there is no shame in recognizing reality. You've heard this voice, haven't you, in your own moments of crisis? The reasonable voice that says, you've given it your best effort. No one could have done more. Perhaps it's time to consider alternatives. The voice that speaks not from cowardice, but from a kind of terrible compassion, for your employees, your family, your investors, for everyone whose lives depend on your decisions. Halifax represents something profound in the British character, not the bulldog determination that Churchill will come to embody, but the older tradition of pragmatic accommodation, the England of careful compromise, of managed decline, of choosing the lesser evil when no good options remain. In the anteroom, Churchill's secretary brings him the overnight cables from Washington. President Roosevelt's latest message is carefully worded, diplomatically precise, and utterly unhelpful. America will provide all aid short of war, lend-lease equipment, moral support, encouraging words, but no American soldiers, no American warships, no American guarantee. Churchill crumples the cable and tosses it into the wastepaper basket. He has spent years cultivating Roosevelt, writing letters, building relationships, painting visions of Anglo-American partnership, and now, when Britain faces her darkest hour, America offers sympathy. The Prime Minister's private secretary knocks gently. "Lord Halifax is ready to present his assessment, sir." Churchill nods, but doesn't move immediately. He stands at the window, looking up through the narrow shaft that brings daylight down to these buried rooms. Somewhere above, London continues its morning routine. Buses running their routes, shops opening, children walking to school, people who trust that their leaders will make the right choices. What is the right choice when every option leads to catastrophe? You know this weight, the crushing responsibility of other people's trust. Your employees believe you'll find a way through. Your investors believe their money is safe. Your family believes you have answers you don't actually possess. And sometimes the responsible thing is to admit that the dream is over. Halifax has prepared his presentation with the thoroughness of a man who has spent decades in government. Charts showing German military superiority, maps illustrating Britain's strategic isolation, economic projections demonstrating that prolonged resistance will bankrupt the empire within months. But more than that, he has prepared the moral argument. How many young men must die, he will ask, for the sake of a gesture? How many cities must burn? How many children must be orphaned, so that we can say we never surrendered? It is the question that haunts every leader who has ever faced impossible odds, the terrible mathematics of sacrifice. How do you weigh certain death against uncertain hope? How do you choose between the destruction of everything you've built and the possibility, however remote, of building something better from the ashes? Sir Edward Bridges sharpens his pencil with mechanical precision. In a few minutes, he will begin taking notes that may record the end of the British Empire. The decision to seek terms. The moment when 1,000 years of island defiance finally yields to continental reality. His handwriting will be steady. His record will be accurate. Because that is what the moment requires. Not heroes or villains, but servants who do their duty regardless of the consequences. The clock on the wall shows 10:47 a.m., May the 27th, 1940. In the main cabinet room, Halifax arranges his final papers. He has served his country for decades, through crises that would have broken lesser men. He has negotiated with Gandhi, faced down the Nazis at Munich, managed the delicate balance of empire and independence. And his judgment, his careful, considered, experienced judgment, is that Britain cannot win this war. Not alone, not against these odds, not without allies who seem more interested in offering sympathy than soldiers. The door opens, Churchill enters, followed by the other members of the War Cabinet. The Prime Minister's face reveals nothing, but Halifax notices the slight tremor in his hands, the weight of sleepless nights, the burden of decisions that no man should have to make. "Gentlemen," Churchill says, settling into his chair, "Lord Halifax has prepared an assessment of our options." The Foreign Secretary rises, and in that moment, the future hangs in perfect balance. Two paths stretch ahead. One leads to negotiated surrender, to managed decline, to the careful preservation of what can be saved from the wreckage. The other leads into darkness, toward a resistance that may destroy everything in the name of preserving something that cannot be quantified or measured or guaranteed. Halifax clears his throat, and history holds its breath. And the weight of decision. In the long silence that follows, Churchill feels the weight of every decision he has ever made, and every decision he has yet to make. The Foreign Secretary's words hang in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Reasonable words, logical words, words that could end this nightmare with a stroke of a pen. But Winston Churchill has spent a lifetime learning that the reasonable path is not always the right one. He shifts in his chair, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders. 75 years old and carrying the weight of an empire that spans a quarter of the globe. His fingers trace the edge of the leather portfolio before him, filled with reports that paint the same grim picture Halifax has just articulated. The numbers don't lie. The odds are insurmountable. Yet something deeper than logic stirs within him, something that has been building through all those wilderness years when his warnings fell on deaf ears. The hum of the telephone exchange filters through the walls. Somewhere in the maze of corridors beyond this room, dozens of young women sit at their switchboards, connecting calls that could determine whether their brothers and fathers will live to see another Christmas. They don't know that in this small, windowless chamber, the very future they're working to defend hangs by the thinnest of threads. Churchill's eyes move across the faces around the table. Chamberlain, still pale from his recent illness, the weight of his own failed appeasement policies etched in every line of his face. Attlee, representing Labour's voice in this unity government, watching with the careful attention of a man who understands that party politics have no place in this moment. And Halifax, steady, diplomatic Halifax, who genuinely believes he is offering salvation. Perhaps he is. The Prime Minister reaches for his teacup, finding it cold. The bitter taste reminds him of all the cold mornings he has awakened to crisis, all the moments when leadership demanded more than he thought he had to give. But this is different. This is not about political survival or parliamentary majorities. This is about something far more fundamental. What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to stand for something when standing costs everything? In the distance, barely audible through the reinforced concrete above, comes the low moan of an air raid siren. The sound seems to rise from the earth itself, a reminder that even here, 30 feet below ground, they cannot escape the reality of what they face. The siren builds to its full cry, then fades into the London night. But its message is clear. Above them, ordinary people are making their way to shelters, carrying their children and their hopes into the darkness. They trust that someone, somewhere, is making the decisions that will keep the light burning. Churchill sets down his cup with deliberate care. The small sound seems to echo in the sudden quiet. Lord Halifax, he says, his voice carrying that familiar rumble that has filled Parliament halls and radio broadcasts. Your assessment is thorough, and I do not doubt the sincerity of your conviction that negotiation offers our best hope. He pauses, gathering not just his words but something deeper, the essence of what he has always believed about leadership, about duty, about the price of civilization itself. But I must ask you this, and I ask it not as your Prime Minister, but as a fellow servant of this island and its people. What do we negotiate with? What do we offer a man who has already demonstrated that his word means nothing, that his appetite grows with each concession? The question hangs in the air. Halifax shifts slightly, preparing to respond, but Churchill continues. We have seen what negotiation with Herr Hitler produces. We have seen Austria. We have seen Czechoslovakia. We have seen Poland. Each time we were told that this would be enough, that this would satisfy him, that this would bring peace. The Prime Minister's voice remains steady, but there is something building beneath it. Not anger, but a kind of moral clarity that cuts through the fog of pragmatic calculation. And each time we discovered that we had merely fed the beast, that we had bought temporary respite at the cost of permanent dishonor. He stands now, moving to the map that dominates one wall of the room. His finger traces the red pins marking German positions. So many pins, so much territory already lost. You speak of preserving the empire, Halifax, of saving what we can, but I would submit to you that some things, once surrendered, cannot be reclaimed. Some defeats are so complete that survival becomes meaningless. Behind him, he can hear the scratch of pencils on paper as secretaries record every word. History being written in real time by exhausted people who have no idea whether anyone will be left to read their careful notes. If we seek terms now, if we acknowledge that Britain can be bought and sold like any other commodity, then what are we preserving? The name, the borders, the institutions? He turns back to face the table, and for a moment, the weight of leadership is visible in every line of his face. This is not the Churchill of the radio broadcasts projecting confidence across the airwaves. This is a man confronting the possibility that everything he has believed about courage and principle might be nothing more than romantic delusion? Or are we preserving something else? Something that cannot be marked on maps or counted in ledgers? The question settles over the room like dust after an explosion. In the silence that follows, each man confronts his own understanding of what they are really discussing. Not just military strategy or diplomatic maneuvering, but the fundamental question of what makes a civilization worth defending. Chamberlain clears his throat softly. Prime Minister, surely we must consider the practical implications. The loss of life that continued resistance would entail. The suffering of our people. Indeed we must, Churchill replies, returning to his seat, and I have considered little else these past weeks. Do you think I sleep easily, knowing that my decisions will send young men to their deaths? Do you think any of us can claim that luxury? He looks around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. But I would ask you to consider this. What manner of life would we be preserving? What kind of peace would we be purchasing? And at what cost to our souls? The words carry a weight that goes beyond politics or strategy. This is Churchill the historian, the man who has spent decades studying the rise and fall of civilizations, who understands that some moments define not just the present, but the entire trajectory of human progress. There are worse things than death, he continues, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. There are worse things than suffering. There is the slow corruption of the spirit that comes from accommodation with evil. There is the gradual erosion of everything that makes us human. Halifax leans forward, his diplomatic instincts engaged. But surely, Prime Minister, we must distinguish between noble sentiment and practical responsibility. We have a duty to preserve what we can of British civilization, to ensure that our people survive, even if diminished. Diminished, Churchill repeats, tasting the word. Yes, that is precisely the question, isn't it? What constitutes acceptable diminishment? How much of ourselves can we surrender and still claim to be ourselves? The air in the room seems to thicken with the weight of the question. Outside, London sleeps fitfully under the constant threat of bombardment. Across the Channel, German forces prepare for an invasion that could come with the next tide. And here, in this small underground chamber, 5 men debate the soul of a nation. I have lived through one great war, Churchill says finally. I have seen what happens when civilized men convince themselves that accommodation with barbarism is wisdom. I have watched as good people, decent people, make reasonable compromises with unreasonable evil. He pauses, and in that pause, the full weight of his experience settles over the room. This is not theoretical for him. This is the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent watching empires rise and fall, watching the slow corruption that comes from choosing safety over principle. And I have learned this above all else, that there are moments when a people must choose what they are willing to become, when they must decide whether they will preserve their bodies at the cost of their souls, or risk everything for the chance to remain themselves. The silence that follows is profound. Each man in the room understands that they have moved beyond military strategy into something far more fundamental. They are not just deciding Britain's fate, they are deciding what Britain means. A flicker of defiance. The weight of that silence settles over the room like dust from ancient battlefields. You can see it in their faces, the recognition that they have crossed some invisible threshold. This is no longer about charts and calculations, supply lines and aircraft counts. This is about the shape of tomorrow's world. Churchill watches each man carefully. He knows that conviction without consensus is merely eloquent defeat. The machinery of government requires more than one voice, however passionate. It requires the quiet agreement of exhausted men who must return to their departments and transform philosophy into action. Clement Attlee shifts in his chair. The Labour leader carries his own weight tonight. The knowledge that his party's supporters, the working families of Britain's industrial cities, will bear the heaviest cost of whatever choice emerges from this room. When he speaks, his voice carries the measured cadence of a man who has spent decades advocating for those who rarely have a voice in such chambers. Prime Minister, he says quietly, you speak of what we might become. But we must also consider what we ask others to become. He pauses, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understands that language shapes reality. The mothers queuing for rations, the fathers working double shifts in the factories, the children who will grow up knowing only blackouts and sirens. What do we ask of them if we choose this path? It's a fair question, perhaps the fairest question of all. Churchill nods slowly, recognizing in Attlee something he has always respected: the refusal to let grand strategy obscure human cost. This is why coalition government works when it works at all. Different perspectives grinding against each other until something like wisdom emerges. We ask them to be what they have always been, Churchill replies. Extraordinary, ordinary people doing impossible things because someone must. His voice drops almost to a whisper. We ask them to trust that their sacrifice serves something larger than survival, something worth preserving. Across the table, Neville Chamberlain stirs. The former Prime Minister carries perhaps the heaviest burden of all: the knowledge that his name will forever be linked with the failure to prevent this moment. History will not be kind to the architect of appeasement. But history is not in this room tonight. Only a tired man who genuinely believed that reason could triumph over madness, that civilization could be preserved through negotiation rather than force. When he speaks, there's something almost confessional in his tone. I spent 3 years believing that accommodation was possible, that reasonable men could find reasonable solutions. He looks directly at Churchill. I was wrong about Hitler. Catastrophically wrong, but I fear I may have been right about war. The admission hangs in the air. This is what leadership looks like when stripped of pretense. Intelligent people acknowledging the limits of their intelligence, experienced people confessing the inadequacy of their experience. In the fluorescent glare of the war rooms, these men seem suddenly, profoundly human. Churchill reaches across the table, a gesture that speaks louder than words. Neville, your mistake was believing that evil could be reasonable. Mine would be believing that reason makes evil impossible. He pauses, letting the weight of shared responsibility settle between them. We are both products of a world that no longer exists. The question is what we build from its ruins. Outside these buried chambers, London settles into another night of blackout. Street lamps remain dark, windows stay curtained. The great city that once blazed with light now practices the art of invisibility, as if darkness itself might provide protection from the bombers that will surely come. But darkness reveals other things. In the muted glow of shielded torches, you can see something that daylight often obscures: the quiet determination of people adapting to impossible circumstances. The milk still gets delivered, the buses still run their routes. Children still walk to school, though they carry gas masks alongside their books. This is what resilience actually looks like, not the dramatic gestures that fill newspaper headlines, but the stubborn insistence on normality when normality itself becomes an act of defiance. The shopkeeper who opens his doors each morning. The teacher who continues lessons despite the air raid warnings. The postman who delivers letters that may be the last words between people who love each other. Churchill knows this, has always known it. His understanding of the British people comes not from polling data or focus groups, but from decades of watching them respond to crisis with a kind of practical stoicism that confounds both enemies and allies. They don't fight because they're naturally warlike. They fight because someone must, and they happen to be the ones standing there when the moment arrives. Back in the war rooms, the conversation has evolved into something more tactical. How do you transform philosophical conviction into governmental policy? How do you align the machinery of state behind a decision that defies conventional wisdom? The answer, Churchill realizes, lies not in commanding agreement, but in cultivating it. In the morning, he will address the outer cabinet, the broader circle of ministers who must implement whatever emerges from tonight's deliberations. They will need more than instructions. They will need inspiration rooted in practical reality. Gentlemen, he says, rising from his chair with the deliberate movement of a man who feels every one of his 65 years, we have talked enough about what we fear. Let us talk about what we dare to hope. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. The conversation moves from defensive to offensive, from preservation to transformation. What if resistance succeeds? What if the impossible becomes merely improbable, then merely difficult, then simply necessary? If we choose this path, Churchill continues, pacing now with growing energy, we are not just defending Britain. We are defending the idea that free peoples can govern themselves. That democracy is not a luxury for peaceful times, but a necessity for all times. That ordinary citizens can make extraordinary choices when they understand what's at stake. Attlee nods slowly. This is language his constituents can understand, not the rhetoric of empire, but the vocabulary of self-determination. Halifax remains skeptical, but his skepticism has shifted from whether resistance is possible to whether it is sustainable. Even Chamberlain seems to be calculating not whether to fight, but how to fight effectively. This is how consensus builds in the crucible of crisis, not through sudden conversion, but through gradual alignment of practical necessity with moral conviction. Each man in the room is finding his own path to the same destination, carrying his own reasons for a shared conclusion. The clock on the wall shows past midnight. In a few hours, Churchill will face the broader cabinet. He will need to present not just a policy, but a vision, a way of understanding Britain's situation that transforms apparent defeat into potential victory, isolation into independence, desperate resistance into purposeful defiance. But first, he needs something else. He needs these men, his closest advisors, his most trusted colleagues, his most formidable opponents, to believe not just in the necessity of resistance, but in its possibility, to see beyond the immediate mathematics of military power to the longer arithmetic of human will. Halifax asked earlier what we preserve through resistance, Churchill says, returning to his chair, but not sitting. Let me tell you what I believe we preserve. We preserve the right of future generations to make their own mistakes, to build their own world, to choose their own leaders and change their minds about those choices. He looks around the room one more time, meeting each pair of eyes. We preserve the possibility that democracy is not an accident of history, but an achievement worth defending. That freedom is not a luxury, but a responsibility. That ordinary people, given accurate information and genuine choice, will usually choose correctly. The silence that follows is different from before. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of recognition. These men have found their way to something like agreement. Not perfect, not complete, but sufficient for the work ahead. In the morning, Churchill will address the outer cabinet. Tonight, he has built the foundation for that address in the minds and hearts of the men who must help him carry it forward. The flicker of defiance has found its fuel. The weight they all carry has not diminished, but it has been distributed, shared among shoulders strong enough to bear it. What they're building is not just a war strategy, but a vision of what comes after. A world where such choices, terrible as they are, remain possible. We shall fight on the beaches. The morning of June 4th, 1940, brings with it the kind of grey London light that seems to hold the city in suspension. Neither fully dark nor truly bright, but something in between. Churchill arrives at the House of Commons carrying more than his usual papers and notes. He carries the weight of a decision that has rippled outward from those underground rooms, through the corridors of power, and now must find its voice in the chamber where Britain's fate will be declared to the world. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when all the private deliberations, all the careful consensus building, all the quiet conversations must transform into public commitment. When what you've been building in the shadows must step into the light and declare itself. The difference between having a vision and staking everything on it. The House is fuller than usual. Word has spread that something significant is coming. Members of Parliament who might normally find excuses to be elsewhere have taken their seats. In the galleries, faces peer down with the particular intensity of people who sense they are about to witness history being made, or unmade. Churchill rises to speak, and the chamber settles into that peculiar kind of silence that comes not from emptiness, but from concentrated attention. Every mind present understands that what follows will define not just policy, but identity, not just strategy, but soul. His voice, when it comes, carries the weight of all those late-night deliberations, but it carries something else as well, a clarity that can only emerge when doubt has been wrestled with and overcome. When the terrible arithmetic of leadership has been completed and the sum total points toward a truth that cannot be avoided, we shall not flag or fail, he declares, and each word falls into the chamber like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward. We shall go on to the end. Listen to the rhythm of what he builds, not the fevered rhetoric of desperation, but the measured cadence of absolute certainty. Each phrase a foundation stone for what comes next. Each commitment a bridge burned behind them, making retreat impossible and advance inevitable. We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. The weight he carries becomes, in this moment, the weight they all carry. The impossible burden transforms into shared purpose. What seemed like the mathematics of defeat reveals itself as the geometry of defiance. Each position they will defend not a place to die, but a place to prove that some things cannot be conquered by force alone. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. Whatever the cost may be. You understand this calculation, don't you? Not the reckless gamble of someone who hasn't counted the price, but the deliberate choice of someone who has counted it completely and decided that some things are worth more than safety, some visions worth more than survival. The chamber is utterly still now, but it's not the stillness of passivity. It's the stillness of water behind a dam, gathering force. Every face turned toward Churchill reflects not just attention, but recognition. The dawning awareness that they are witnessing the moment when a nation chooses what it will become. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. Each location he names becomes sacred in the naming. Not just tactical positions, but symbols of something larger. The beaches where invasion might come, the landing grounds where the first battles might be fought, the fields and streets and hills where ordinary people will decide whether civilization bends or breaks under pressure. And then the words that will echo through history, we shall never surrender. Never, not a word chosen lightly by a man who has spent his life studying the rise and fall of empires. Not the bravado of someone who hasn't seen what surrender looks like, but the commitment of someone who has seen it clearly and decided that some fates are worse than any struggle required to avoid them. The silence that follows is profound. Not empty, but full, pregnant with the weight of recognition. Something has shifted in that chamber, something that goes beyond politics or strategy. A line has been drawn, not in sand, but in something more permanent. A choice has been made that cannot be unmade. When the applause comes, it builds slowly at first, then swells into something that seems to shake the very foundations of the building. But listen carefully to its quality. This is not the applause of entertainment or even approval. This is the applause of commitment. The sound of people binding themselves to a vision they might not survive but cannot abandon. Members rise to their feet, and you can see in their faces the transformation that has taken place. The weight they carried into this chamber as individual burdens has become something else entirely. A shared load that somehow feels lighter for being distributed among so many shoulders, yet heavier for being so completely embraced. Outside, London continues its daily rhythm. People queue for buses, shopkeepers open their doors, children walk to school, but something has changed in the air itself. Word of Churchill's speech spreads through the city like ripples on water. Not as information, but as transformation. In pubs and parlors, on street corners and in tea shops, people repeat the phrases to each other. We shall fight on the beaches becomes not just policy, but identity. We shall never surrender becomes not just strategy, but soul. The shift in public opinion is almost tangible. Where there had been uncertainty, even fear, there is now something harder to define but impossible to miss. Not confidence exactly. The odds haven't changed. The German war machine remains as formidable as ever, but something else has emerged. A kind of settled determination that makes calculations of probability seem somehow beside the point. Later, as evening settles over the city, Churchill finds himself in the Garden of Remembrance. It's a small space tucked away from the noise and urgency of Whitehall, a place where the names of those who gave everything in previous struggles are carved in stone and honored in silence. Here, surrounded by the memory of sacrifice, the magnitude of what has been set in motion becomes clear. Not just a military strategy, but a moral commitment. Not just a political position, but a civilizational choice. The weight of all those who came before, all those who will come after, settles around him like a mantle. The flowers planted here bloom despite the uncertainty of the times, small acts of beauty persisting in the face of overwhelming darkness. Perhaps this is what defiance really looks like. Not the grand gestures that make headlines, but the quiet insistence that some things remain worth preserving, worth tending, worth believing in. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new impossible decisions, new weights to carry. But tonight, in this small garden where memory and hope intersect, there is peace. The peace that comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the presence of purpose. Not from knowing the outcome, but from knowing the choice has been made correctly. What you're building, like what Churchill built that day, is not just a response to crisis, but a vision of what remains possible when everything seems impossible. The weight you carry is not just your own, but part of something larger. A continuous thread of human determination that refuses to accept that force alone can determine the shape of the future. The speech is over. The commitment is made. What comes next will test every word spoken, every promise made. But the foundation has been laid, and it is solid. Echoes of courage. In the days that follow, Churchill will return again and again to those underground rooms, the electric bulbs casting their steady light on maps that show the scope of what they face. The weight of the decision settles not as burden, but as clarity. There is something profoundly liberating about choosing the harder path when you know it is the right one. The cables arrive throughout the night. Reports from the continent, updates from the Admiralty. Each piece of information confirms what they already knew, that the odds remain impossibly long, that the German war machine continues its relentless advance. But something fundamental has shifted. The paralysis of indecision has been replaced by the energy of commitment. In his private study, Churchill makes notes in the margins of his speeches. Small adjustments, refinements of language that will matter in the broadcasts to come. His handwriting is steady despite the late hour. This is the work that few will see, the careful crafting of words that must carry a nation through its darkest passage. The weight you carry as a leader is often invisible to those you serve. They see the public moments, the decisive statements, the confident bearing. They cannot see the 2 a.m. calculations, the careful weighing of consequences, the moments of doubt that must be worked through in solitude before dawn breaks. Halifax, in his own quarters, reviews the transcripts of the day's discussions. History will judge them all, but tonight there is only the immediate reality of what must be done. Even in disagreement, there was respect for the magnitude of what they were deciding. The luxury of perfect certainty is rarely available to those who must choose while the storm is still gathering. The cleaning staff move quietly through the corridors of power, emptying wastepaper baskets filled with discarded drafts, straightening chairs around tables where the fate of nations was debated. They understand, perhaps better than anyone, that great decisions are built from countless small moments of preparation. In the weeks ahead, Churchill will walk these same corridors during air raids, the building shaking above them while the work continues below. The physical courage required will be significant, but it pales beside the moral courage already demonstrated. The hardest battles are often fought before the first shot is fired. The echoes of that May evening will reverberate through everything that follows. When the Battle of Britain begins in earnest, when London burns, when the Atlantic convoys face their greatest trials, the foundation laid in those underground rooms will hold, not because the path chosen was easy, but because it was chosen with full understanding of its cost. There is something you learn about yourself when you refuse the easier surrender. Not just what you can endure, but what you become in the enduring. The weight you carry transforms from burden into strength, from obligation into purpose. The stenographers who recorded those crucial meetings will keep their notes for decades, understanding that they witnessed something that mattered beyond the immediate moment. Democracy, at its finest, is not the absence of difficult decisions, but the willingness to make them through deliberation rather than force. Churchill's maps remain spread across the tables, weighted down with small brass markers. Each position represents thousands of lives, entire communities whose futures hang in the balance. The responsibility is staggering, but it is matched by the clarity of purpose that comes from choosing principle over expedience. What strikes you, looking back, is not just the courage of the decision, but the courage of those who supported it. Attlee, setting aside party politics for national survival, Chamberlain supporting a policy that implicitly criticized his own previous approach. Even Halifax, accepting a decision he believed was wrong because the process had been right. The weight you carry is always shared. even when it doesn't feel that way. Every leader stands on foundations built by others, the accumulated wisdom of those who faced similar choices, the institutional strength of systems designed to outlast any individual, the quiet competence of people who do their work regardless of who makes the headlines. In his final notes that evening, Churchill writes simply, "We have chosen our course. Now we must prove worthy of it." The words are understated, but they capture something essential about leadership under pressure. The decision is only the beginning. Everything that follows must justify the choice made. The lights in the cabinet war rooms burn late into the night, not with the frantic energy of crisis, but with the steady rhythm of work that must be done. There are plans to refine, resources to marshal, messages to craft. The luxury of dramatic gestures has passed. What remains is the patient building of what was promised. Years later, historians will debate the alternatives. What might have happened if different choices had been made? But for those who lived through that May evening, the path forward was clear. Not easy, never easy, but clear. And in that clarity lay the strength to face whatever was coming. The echoes of courage do not fade. They build upon themselves, creating resonances that carry far beyond their original moment. What you choose to become under pressure shapes not just your own future, but the possibilities available to those who come after. The weight you carry tonight, it too will echo forward, becoming part of that continuous thread of human determination that refuses to accept that the future is already written. Anta, a lasting legacy. And in those echoes, something remarkable happens. The decisions made in that underground bunker begin to ripple outward, touching lives that will never know their names, shaping futures that stretch far beyond the immediate crisis. The weight of leadership, when carried with moral courage, becomes something more than burden. It becomes foundation. Tonight, decades later, you can still walk through those cabinet war rooms. The maps remain pinned to the walls, their colored pins marking positions that once meant everything. The telephones sit silent on their desks, no longer carrying the urgent voices that once coordinated the defense of civilization itself. But something lingers there. Something that speaks to the part of you that understands what it means to carry weight that others cannot see. There is Churchill's chair, worn smooth by the hours he spent leaning forward, studying reports, making calculations that balanced hope against reality. There is the small bedroom where he would catch what sleep he could between the endless succession of crises. And there, in the corner, is the simple wooden table where he would sit in the early morning hours, when the immediate fires had been put out, and think about what they were really fighting for. The weight you carry tonight, it shares something fundamental with what was carried in those rooms. Not the scale, perhaps, but the essence. The knowledge that your decisions matter, that what you choose to become under pressure will determine not just your own future, but the possibilities you create for others. The understanding that leadership, at its deepest level, is about holding space for hope when hope seems unreasonable. In the months and years that followed Churchill's speech, as the Battle of Britain raged overhead and the Blitz tested London's resolve, something extraordinary emerged from that initial choice to fight on. Not just military victory, though that would come, but something deeper, a demonstration that moral courage, when it finds its voice, can shift the entire trajectory of what seems possible. The young pilots who climbed into their Spitfires each morning, knowing the odds, they carried forward the echo of that decision made in the underground bunker. The families who emerged from bomb shelters to find their homes destroyed, then quietly began to rebuild. They too were living out the implications of that choice to refuse surrender. The engineers working through the night to repair damaged factories, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park wrestling with impossible puzzles, the ordinary citizens who simply continued to believe that civilization was worth defending. All of them became part of that expanding circle of courage. And now, in this quiet moment before sleep, you can feel yourself connected to that same tradition. The weight you carry as you build something meaningful in an uncertain world, it places you in a lineage that stretches back through all the moments when someone chose to stand firm rather than step aside, when someone decided that what they were protecting mattered more than their own comfort or safety. The late nights you spend refining your vision, the difficult conversations you have with investors or partners or team members, the moments when you lie awake calculating risks and wondering if you have the strength to continue. These are not burdens you carry alone. They connect you to everyone who has ever chosen to take responsibility for something larger than themselves. In the cabinet war rooms, there is one image that stays with visitors long after they leave. It is simply an empty chair, positioned as it would have been during those crucial meetings in May 1940. The chair where someone sat and made decisions that changed the course of history. But it is empty now, waiting, as if to remind us that the capacity for such moments exists in every generation, in every person who finds themselves carrying weight that matters. Your chair, wherever you sit when you make the decisions that define what you're building, it too is part of this continuing story. The courage you summon when facing impossible choices, the clarity you find when everything seems uncertain, the strength you discover when you choose to continue rather than surrender. These become part of the foundation that others will build upon. The echoes of May 1940 are still reverberating. In every startup that refuses to give up when funding runs dry. In every leader who chooses transparency over expedience. In every moment when someone decides that their values are not negotiable, even under pressure. The specific challenges change, but the fundamental choice remains the same, between accommodation and integrity, between what is easy and what is right. And so, as you finally allow your mind to settle, as the weight you carry begins to transform from burden into strength, remember this: the courage you show tonight, the determination you maintain in the face of uncertainty, the integrity you preserve when it would be easier to compromise. These too will echo forward. They will become part of the foundation upon which tomorrow's possibilities are built. The empty chair in the war room is not really empty at all. It is occupied by everyone who chooses to carry weight that matters, who decides that what they are building is worth the cost, who understands that true leadership means holding space for hope even when hope requires everything you have to give. And in that choice, in that moment of quiet determination, the future itself begins to take shape around the courage you are willing to become.